Did you know that for many soldiers in the Second World War, the enemy they saw the most was not another man in a different uniform? It was the mud, or the cold, or the endless, soul-crushing boredom. We often think of war as a constant series of dramatic battles, but the reality was very different. For every minute of terrifying action, there were hours, days, even weeks of waiting. The true fight was often against the mundane, the overlooked, and the deeply personal. What did it feel like to be constantly hungry, not for a day, but for a year? How do you keep your mind from unraveling when the single biggest event of your day is a letter from home that might not even arrive? These weren't side issues, they were the main event. They dictated strategy, broke armies, and defined the daily existence of millions of people. This was the war fought between the battles. Number 19, could your own uniform betray you? You get your gear. A uniform, boots, a helmet. They are supposed to protect you, to make you part of a team. But what happens when that gear is your worst enemy? This was a real and constant problem. The logistics of outfitting millions of soldiers meant that equipment was often standardized. But the environments they fought in were anything but. The result was a constant draining battle against their own clothing and shoes. Take the American experience in the winter of 1944. During the fighting in the Ardennes forest, troops were caught in one of the coldest winters in years. Many soldiers were still wearing standard leather boots with a thin wool sock. They were not designed for sub-zero temperatures and deep snow. The boots would get wet, freeze, and stay frozen. The condition known as trench foot, a serious ailment caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet, became rampant. It's a nasty thing. Your feet become numb, change color, and the tissue begins to die. It could lead to amputation. The number of non-combat casualties from cold injuries was staggering. In some divisions, the number of men evacuated for exposure and frostbite rivaled the number of battle casualties. The historian Stephen E. Ambrose, in his book Citizen Soldiers, details how men would try to line their inadequate boots with straw, paper, anything to get an extra layer of insulation. A better boot, the M43, with a higher cuff and more water resistance, was in production, but not enough had reached the front lines. The difference between having the new boots and the old ones could be the difference between staying in the fight and losing a foot. It wasn't just the cold. In the Pacific Theater, the opposite was true. Early on, American Marines were issued herringbone twill utility uniforms. They were tough, but they were also heavy and slow to dry in the sweltering, humid jungles of places like Guadalcanal. They trapped heat and moisture, contributing to skin diseases, fungal infections, and heat exhaustion. Soldiers would be soaked in sweat and rain for days on end. Their gear would rot, leather would mold. Everything was constantly damp. The book With the Old Breed by Eugene Sledge describes this in painful detail. He writes about how their clothes were almost never fully dry, how the constant wetness ate away at their skin and their morale. The British faced similar issues in North Africa. Their standard khaki wool uniforms were perfect for a chilly day in England, but in the Libyan desert, they were instruments of torment. The wool was hot, itchy, and held the heat. They eventually developed more suitable khaki drill uniforms, but in the early stages of the Desert War, men were fighting the heat as much as anything else. They had to learn to adapt, often shedding as much clothing as they could get away with, creating their own non-regulation gear to survive. It was a lesson learned across every army. The war of logistics and procurement, fought in offices thousands of miles away, had a direct and brutal impact on the men on the ground. A bureaucrat's decision on fabric type made a year earlier could become a matter of life and death. What was the true number of casualties caused not by weapons, but by poorly designed boots? How many strategic plans failed because the soldiers were too sick and exhausted from fighting their own equipment? And what brilliant, simple inventions did ordinary soldiers create in the field to fix these problems that were never officially adopted? Number 18, what was the heaviest thing they carried? It wasn't just the fear, it wasn't just the memory of home. The heaviest thing many soldiers carried was, quite literally, the stuff on their backs. The sheer physical weight of their equipment was a constant, grinding opponent that never surrendered and never slept. It drained their energy, slowed their movements, and broke their bodies down long before they ever saw a fight. An American infantryman in Europe carried a staggering amount of gear. Let's just list some of it. The M1 rifle was about 9.5 pounds. A belt with 10 clips of ammunition was another 10 pounds. The steel helmet was 3 pounds. Then you had the pack. Inside you might find a wool blanket, a shelter, half a tent poles and stakes, a mess kit, and rations. Strapped to the outside was the entrenching tool, a small shovel that was critically important, weighing another couple of pounds. The bayonet, like a canteen of water or two. Grenades, maybe extra bandoliers of ammunition slung over their shoulders. If you were a machine gunner or a mortarman, the load was even worse, carrying heavy base plates, barrels, or boxes of ammunition. All told, an infantryman could be hauling anywhere from 60 to 90 pounds. Now, imagine carrying that not on a paved road, but through thick mud, up a steep hill, or through a dense forest for miles and miles, day after day. The physical toll was immense. Historian John C. McManus, in his books on the U.S. Army in Europe, describes how the simple act of marching became an ordeal of survival. Men would develop raw sores from the straps rubbing their shoulders. Their backs ached constantly. Their feet, trapped in leather boots and carrying this immense weight, were a source of perpetual pain. The exhaustion was bone deep. It wasn't just about being tired. It was about being systematically worn down. This physical depletion had a direct impact on their effectiveness. A soldier who has just marched 15 miles with 70 pounds on his back is not going to be as alert or as quick to react as one who is rested. This wasn't just a problem for one army. Every soldier from every nation felt it. German soldiers were famous for their heavy leather jackboots and extensive field gear. And Soviet soldiers, while often more lightly equipped, still had to carry the essentials for survival on the Eastern Front. In his landmark, if controversial work, Men Against Fire, S.L.E. Marshall argued that one of the primary reasons many soldiers didn't fire their weapons in combat was sheer physical exhaustion. They were too spent from the effort of simply getting to the battlefield. The weight was a force of nature, like gravity itself, always pulling them down. They developed tricks to manage it, like ditching non-essential items, but that came with its own risks. Throw away your blanket to save 5 pounds and you might freeze that night. It was a constant, miserable calculation. How much did this chronic fatigue and physical pain contribute to the psychological stress disorders that afflicted so many? Did the armies that figured out how to lighten their soldiers' loads gain a subtle but significant advantage on the battlefield? And what long-term orthopedic problems did a generation of men carry with them for the rest of their lives because of the burdens they were forced to bear? Number 17, how do you fight an enemy you can't see or shoot? One of the most lethal enemies in the Second World War was microscopic. It didn't carry a weapon, wear a uniform, or follow orders, but it was responsible for sidelining, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. This was the war against disease, insects, and parasites. On many fronts, especially in the Pacific and Mediterranean, the casualty list from sickness dwarfed the list of those harmed in battle. In the early Pacific campaigns, like the fight for Guadalcanal in 1942, malaria was the primary enemy. The Solomon Islands were a perfect breeding ground for the Anopheles mosquito, the carrier of the disease. Soldiers hacking their way through dense, swampy jungles were bitten relentlessly. At first, the effects were devastating. Men would come down with raging fevers, chills that shook their entire bodies, and debilitating weakness. The units were crippled. At certain points, the number of men out of action due to malaria was more than 10 times the number of combat casualties. The historian Richard B. Frank, in Guadalcanal, the definitive account of the landmark battle, notes that by the end of the campaign, the American medical officer estimated that over 60% of the troops had contracted the disease. It was a silent, insidious force that could sap an entire army's strength. The development and distribution of the anti-malarial drug atibrine was a turning point. It didn't prevent infection, but it suppressed the symptoms, allowing soldiers to keep fighting. But the pills had side effects, turning the skin a sickly yellow, and compliance was a constant issue. It wasn't just malaria. Dysentery was everywhere. In any place where sanitation was poor and water sources were contaminated, which was basically every front line, soldiers suffered from severe intestinal illnesses. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a physically draining and utterly demoralizing condition. In the heat of the North African desert or the filth of the Italian winter, an outbreak of the GIs or the trots could render a platoon combat ineffective. Men were too weak to carry their gear, let alone fight. Then there were the pests. Lice were a constant companion in the trenches and foxholes of Europe. They spread diseases like trench fever and typhus. They caused constant itching and discomfort, making it impossible to get proper rest. Soldiers would try to get rid of them by running a lit match along the seams of their clothes, a process they called retting their shirt. In his memoir, Goodbye, Darkness, William Manchester vividly describes the sheer misery of being infested with lice, the feeling of being constantly dirty, of your own body being invaded. Rats were another plague. Especially in static trench lines, they would get into food supplies and were a constant, unnerving presence in the dark. The war against these tiny creatures was a daily, personal, and disgusting struggle that never ended. How many battles were lost or postponed because the commanding officer realized his men were simply too sick to fight? What was the true psychological toll of living in a state of constant filth and infestation for years on end? And are there still undiscovered long-term health consequences that veterans suffered from due to the barrage of tropical diseases and powerful medications they were exposed to? Number 16, when is silence the most terrifying sound? We think of battle as loud. Explosions, machinery, shouting. And it was. But one of the most difficult and unexpected challenges for a soldier on the front line was dealing with the opposite of that noise, the silence. Or, more accurately, the wrong kinds of silence and the constant nerve-shredding sounds that filled the gaps between battles. The sonic environment of war was a form of psychological torture. Imagine being in a foxhole at night. The fighting has died down, but it's not quiet. There's the distant, intermittent rumble of artillery, so far away it's more of a feeling in your chest than a sound. There's the drone of a single, unseen airplane high overhead. Is it one of yours? One of theirs? You don't know. The wind rustles the leaves in the tree line 100 yards away. Was that the wind? Or was it someone moving? Every creak, every snap of a twig, every rustle becomes a potential threat. This hyper-vigilance, sustained for hours, days, weeks, is mentally exhausting. Your auditory system is on high alert, trying to decipher a language of sounds where a misinterpretation could be fatal. In Memoirs from Every Front, soldiers talk about this. Paul Fussell, in his book The Great War and Modern Memory, which focuses on the First World War but whose observations are timeless, wrote extensively about how soldiers became connoisseurs of sound, able to distinguish different types of shells by the specific noise they made as they flew overhead. This was a necessary survival skill, but it meant you could never truly relax. Your brain was always working, always listening, always analyzing. Then there was the silence that came after a massive bombardment. A deafening barrage would go on for an hour, shaking the ground, filling the air with a physical presence. And then suddenly it would stop. That abrupt absence of noise was for many the most terrifying moment of all. They knew it was the signal. It meant the attack was coming. The silence was the sound of impending danger. It was a vacuum of noise that was more menacing than the noise itself. Beyond the sounds of battle, there was the noise of the machinery of war. The constant rumble of truck convoys, the clank and squeal of tank treads, the whine of generators. It was a 24/7 industrial soundscape that denied men any real peace. Sleep was difficult and often interrupted. This lack of true restorative quiet contributed significantly to the buildup of stress and fatigue. A 2011 study by the U.S. Army on the effects of noise on soldiers found that continuous exposure to noise, even at moderate levels, degrades cognitive performance and increases stress levels. While they were studying modern soldiers, the principle is the same. The human nervous system is not designed to be in a state of constant auditory alert. After a while, it begins to wear out. The front line was an environment that never let you fully lower your guard, and sound was the primary medium of that constant threat. How did the human brain adapt to processing this level of threatening auditory information for years on end? What percentage of shell shock or combat fatigue cases were caused or exacerbated not by a single traumatic event, but by the slow, grinding erosion of the nerves from constant noise and tension? And Did soldiers who grew up in quiet rural areas have a harder time coping with this sonic overload than those who came from noisy cities? Number 15, how can you be surrounded by people and utterly alone? A soldier is part of a unit, a squad, a platoon, a company. You live, eat, and sleep within feet of other people. Your survival depends on them, and theirs on you. From the outside, it looks like the ultimate team environment. But one of the most profound and unexpected struggles of frontline life was an intense, gnawing loneliness. It was a loneliness that came from being disconnected from everything that made you an individual. The primary source of this was the separation from home. Letters were the only lifeline to family, to girlfriends, to a world where life was normal, but mail was slow and unreliable. A letter could take weeks, even months, to cross an ocean. In the meantime, a soldier was left in a state of suspended animation. He would write home, pouring his heart out, but by the time his family read it, his situation could have changed dramatically. He could be in a completely different place or worse. The replies he received were ghosts from the past, describing a life that felt a million miles away. Ernie Pyle, the famous war correspondent, wrote beautifully about this. He described soldiers huddled together, reading and rereading letters until the paper was worn thin, trying to hold on to a piece of that other world. This disconnect created a profound sense of isolation. You were living a reality that your loved ones could never, ever understand. You couldn't tell them the truth of what you were seeing and feeling, partly because of censorship, but mostly because there were no words for it. You were living on a different planet. There was also a loneliness that could exist even within the unit. The military, by design, breaks down individuality to build a cohesive group. You wear the same uniform, get the same haircut, follow the same orders. This can be a source of strength, but it can also feel like an erasure of self. Soldiers often came from wildly different backgrounds: a farmer from Iowa, a factory worker from Detroit, a student from Boston, thrown together by circumstance. While deep bonds were formed, it was not always easy to find someone you could truly connect with on a personal level. You might be surrounded by comrades, but feel like no one truly knew who you were before the war. And then there was the ultimate loneliness, the feeling of being a tiny, interchangeable part in an incomprehensible machine. The scale of the war was so vast, it was impossible for an individual soldier to see how his small piece of the puzzle fit into the grand strategy. You were told to take a hill, hold a crossroads, or dig a trench. You often had no idea why. This could lead to a feeling of utter insignificance. The book The Naked and the Dead by Norman Mailer, a novel but one deeply rooted in his own experiences, masterfully captures this sense of powerlessness and alienation felt by the common soldier who is moved around a map by distant, unseen forces. Your life was governed by decisions made by people you would never meet for reasons you would never be told. How many soldiers' morale broke not from fear, but from the simple human ache of profound loneliness? Did the efficiency of the mail service have a direct, measurable impact on the combat effectiveness of a division? And when the war was over, did this profound sense of being disconnected from the normal world ever truly go away for those who experienced it? Number 14, what do you do when the ground itself becomes your enemy? Soldiers expect to fight other soldiers. They don't expect to fight the planet. But on many fronts of the Second World War, the terrain specifically, the mud was a more formidable and demoralizing foe than any army. Mud immobilizes. It exhausts. It swallows equipment and souls. It turns the simplest task into a Herculean effort. The Italian campaign is perhaps the most infamous example. After the landings in 1943, Allied forces began the long, slow slog up the Italian peninsula. The country's geography with its mountains and river valleys was difficult enough, but when the autumn rains came, the landscape dissolved into a sea of thick, clinging mud. It was not just dirt and water, it was a unique glutinous substance, often mixed with volcanic soil, that stuck to everything. As roads disappeared, fields became impassable swamps. A simple walk from a supply truck to a foxhole could take an hour, with each footstep a struggle to pull your boot out of the muck's grasp. Vehicles were rendered useless. Tanks, trucks, and jeeps would sink up to their axles, becoming nothing more than stationary targets. The entire logistical chain, the lifeblood of a modern army, could grind to a halt. The famous cartoonist and journalist Bill Malden captured the misery of the Italian mud perfectly in his Willie and Joe cartoons. His drawings showed exhausted, bearded soldiers perpetually half-buried in muck, with captions that perfectly expressed the grim, weary resignation of men in an impossible situation. One of his most famous cartoons shows a soldier asking another, "My God, here they come. How long has it been since you were cleaned up for a parade?" as they lie in a muddy shell hole. The same story was repeated on the Eastern Front. The vast, flat plains of Ukraine and Russia turned into an ocean of mud during the spring thaw of the Rasputitsa and the autumn rains. The German advance in 1941 was famously stalled as much by the mud as by the resistance they met. Entire divisions were paralyzed. Wheeled vehicles were useless, and even tracked vehicles struggled. Horses, relied on heavily for transport, would drop from exhaustion trying to pull wagons through the mire. In his book, The Forgotten Soldier, Guy Sager, a Frenchman who fought for the German army on the Eastern Front, gives terrifying accounts of being mired in mud so deep that men and horses drowned in it. The mud became a physical entity, an active antagonist in the war. This constant battle with the earth had a profound physical and psychological effect. It was endlessly exhausting. It was filthy. It contributed to health problems like trench foot, and it was deeply demoralizing. To be thwarted, not by a clever enemy tactic, but by the very ground you stood on, created a unique sense of helplessness. Progress was measured in yards, and each yard was purchased with incredible physical effort. The mud was a great equalizer. It didn't care which side you were on. It just consumed. How many thousands of tons of vital equipment were simply abandoned and lost forever in the mud of Italy and Russia? Did the engineers and logisticians who had to figure out how to operate in these conditions, building corduroy roads, using mules instead of trucks, ever get the credit they deserved for keeping the armies moving at all? And what is the long-term environmental impact of all that metal and machinery still buried under the fields of Europe? Number 13, could you trust the food you were given? Like an army, as the old saying goes, marches on its stomach, but what if the food it's given is monotonous, unappetizing, and sometimes barely edible? The logistics of feeding millions of men spread across the globe was one of the great challenges of the war. The solutions, like canned rations, were practical marvels of production, but for the soldiers who had to eat them day in and day out, the food was another unexpected hardship to be endured. For American soldiers, the most famous or infamous ration was Spam, the canned pork product. It was shipped to every theater of war in massive quantities. At first, it might have been a welcome taste of meat, but after weeks, months, and even years of it, the endless repetition became a form of torture. It was served fried for breakfast, cold in sandwiches for lunch, and mixed into stews for dinner. Soldiers came up with dozens of derisive nicknames for it, like ham that didn't pass its physical. The book G. Joe, The Story of the American Soldier in World War II by Robert Leckie is filled with anecdotes about the soldier's relationship with Spam. It wasn't just Spam, though. The C ration consisted of canned entrees, biscuits, and coffee. The K ration was a smaller, more compact version designed for airborne troops, with a bizarre assortment that could include a canned cheese product, dry biscuits, and a fruit bar. While these rations provided the necessary calories to keep a soldier functioning, they were culinary deserts. The lack of variety, the processed taste, and the sheer monotony wore on the men's morale. A fresh apple, a loaf of real bread, or a hot-cooked meal became the ultimate luxury. The situation was often grimmer for other armies. British soldiers had to contend with, bully beef, canned corned beef, and hardtack biscuits, a tradition that went back centuries. On the Eastern Front, both German and Soviet soldiers often operated on the brink of starvation. Supply lines were long and frequently cut. They had to forage for food, living off the land, which could mean anything from potatoes dug out of a frozen field to a horse that had been killed in the fighting. The lack of food was a constant gnawing presence. It made men weak, it made them desperate, it focused their minds on one thing: survival. This wasn't just a matter of taste. The nutritional quality of these rations was often poor. They were heavy on preservatives, salt, and fat, but lacked fresh vegetables and vitamins. Soldiers suffered from vitamin deficiencies and other health problems related to poor diet. The psychological impact was also significant. Food is a source of comfort, a connection to home and normalcy. To be deprived of that, to be forced to eat the same tasteless factory-produced substance day after day, was another way the war stripped away a soldier's humanity. It was another reminder of how far they were from home and how little control they had over their own lives. How much did nutritional deficiencies affect the cognitive function and physical performance of troops in long campaigns? Did the shared experience of hating their rations paradoxically become a bonding experience for the soldiers? And are there any reliable studies on the long-term health consequences for a generation of men who lived for years on a diet of processed canned food? Number 12, what happens when you can never get clean? In civilian life, we take basic hygiene for granted. A hot shower, clean clothes, a flush toilet. For a frontline soldier, these were unimaginable luxuries. One of the most pervasive and demoralizing problems they faced was the inability to ever get truly clean. This constant state of filth wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dehumanizing and dangerous to their health. For months on end, soldiers wore the same uniform. It became stiff with sweat, dirt, and mud. They rarely had the opportunity to wash it. When they did, it was usually in a bucket of cold, often dirty water. They could go for weeks or even months without a shower. The thick wool uniforms and leather boots trapped moisture and dirt, creating a perfect environment for bacteria and fungi to grow. As skin diseases were rampant, rashes, boils, and fungal infections like jungle rot in the Pacific were a constant misery. These weren't minor annoyances, they could be incredibly painful and incapacitating. The simple act of using a toilet was gone. On the front line, sanitation consisted of a slit trench episode, a shallow ditch that served as a communal latrine. These were often exposed, foul-smelling, and swarming with flies. They were a major source for the spread of diseases like dysentery. The lack of privacy was total. It was another aspect of life that stripped away dignity and forced men to live like animals. In his memoir, With the Old Breed, E.B. Sledge writes in stark terms about the appalling sanitary conditions on islands like Peleliu, where the ground was hard coral and digging proper latrines was almost impossible. The stench was overwhelming and inescapable. This inability to get clean had a profound psychological impact. To be constantly dirty, to smell your own unwashed body day after day wears you down. It's a constant reminder of your degraded circumstances. It makes you feel less than human. The rare occasions when a unit was pulled off the line and had a chance to go to a rear area for a shower were momentous. Men would describe the feeling of hot water on their skin as a near-religious experience. To be able to put on a clean set of clothes, even for a day, was to feel like a person again. It was a brief return to a civilization they had left behind. Ernie Pyle wrote about seeing men come back from the line, their faces caked with dirt, their beards matted, their eyes weary. He noted that the first thing they wanted wasn't always food or sleep, it was a chance to wash. How much did the constant stress and discomfort of being filthy contribute to the overall psychological breakdown of soldiers? Were there measurable differences in morale and combat effectiveness between units with regular access to bathing facilities and those without? And what unrecorded acts of ingenuity did soldiers employ to try and maintain some small semblance of hygiene in impossible conditions? Or number 11, how do you navigate when the world has been erased? Getting lost is a common human experience, but for a soldier on the front line, getting lost could be a fatal mistake. Navigation was a constant and surprisingly difficult problem. Maps could be inaccurate, landmarks could be destroyed, and the technology we take for granted today simply didn't exist. Soldiers relied on a map and a compass. That was it. But maps produced by military intelligence were not always reliable. They might be based on old surveys, or they might not show recent changes to the landscape. A town marked on the map might have been reduced to a pile of rubble. A forest that was supposed to provide cover might have been burned to the ground. A road could be impassable. In the chaos of a fluid battlefield, the map in your hand and the world in front of you often did not match. In the dense, unfamiliar terrain of European forests like the Hurtgen forest, where visibility was limited and landmarks were few, units frequently became disoriented. A company could take a wrong turn and wander into a minefield or an enemy ambush. The book, The Battle of Hurtgen Forest by Charles B. MacDonald, is a chilling account of how the confusing, repetitive landscape of the forest became an enemy in itself, swallowing units whole. Night operations made the problem 100 times worse. Trying to navigate through unfamiliar, hostile territory in pitch darkness, often under strict orders not to use any lights, was a nightmare. A patrol could miss its objective by a few hundred yards and end up completely lost, having to wait until dawn to try and figure out where they were. The stress on the NCOs and junior officers responsible for leading these patrols was immense. Their men's lives depended on their ability to read a map in the dark and count their paces to measure distance. Even the weather could conspire against them. Heavy fog, rain, or a snowstorm could reduce visibility to a few feet, making navigation by landmark impossible. In the desert, sandstorms could blot out the sun and erase any tracks, leaving vehicle columns disoriented in a sea of sand. The British Long-Range Desert Group, which operated deep behind enemy lines in North Africa, became masters of desert navigation, using sun compasses and celestial navigation, skills more common to sailors than soldiers. But for the average infantryman, a sudden change in the weather could be a disaster. This was a problem for all armies. For new recruits thrown into a foreign country for the first time, the landscape was completely alien. The road signs were in a different language, the architecture was different, even the vegetation was different. It was easy to get turned around. The feeling of being lost, of being cut off from your unit and alone in a hostile environment was a terrifying experience. It was a quiet personal battle fought by thousands of soldiers every day. What percentage of casualties were the direct result of navigational errors? How did armies try to train soldiers for the intense psychological pressure of navigating under fire? And how many stories of survival are out there from soldiers who got lost and had to find their way back to friendly lines on their own? Number 10, where did they go to grieve? In the midst of the chaos and destruction of the front lines, a deeply personal and silent crisis was unfolding for countless soldiers' grief. When a close friend was lost, there was no time and no space to process it. The war demanded you keep moving, keep fighting, keep functioning. The suppression of one of the most fundamental human emotions was an immense and often invisible burden. In a civilian setting, when someone dies, there are rituals, funerals, memorials, a period of mourning where family and friends come together to share their sorrow. These things provide comfort and a way to begin healing. On the front line, none of that existed. A man you had shared a foxhole with, someone you had trained with for months and told your life story to, could be gone in an instant. His body would be taken away by medics or graves registration personnel. His personal effects would be collected to be sent home to his family. And that was it. There was no ceremony, there was no closure. The hole he left in the fabric of the unit was immediate and gaping, but you were expected to patch it over and carry on as if nothing had happened. This created a profound psychological conflict. The bonds formed between soldiers in combat are incredibly intense. They rely on each other for their very survival. The loss of a comrade was like losing a brother. Yet to dwell on that loss was a luxury they couldn't afford. To give in to grief could dull your senses, make you lose focus, and get you or someone else killed. So they learned to compartmentalize, to build a wall around their emotions. In his book Dark Krieg, The War, the German writer Ludwig Renn, reflecting on his experiences in the First World War, described this phenomenon. He noted how soldiers developed a hard, protective shell. It was a necessary defense mechanism, but it came at a cost. This unexpressed grief would build up over time. The losses would accumulate. A soldier might lose one friend, then another, then his entire original squad. Each loss added another layer of sorrow, buried under the surface. This cumulative, unprocessed grief was a major contributor to what was then called combat fatigue, or shell shock. It was a weight that became heavier with each passing day. Soldiers would sometimes find small private ways to mourn. They might take a keepsake from a fallen friend day, a photo, a letter, or simply say a private prayer. But there was no formal outlet. The grief was a solitary burden carried in the heart of each man, and the constant exposure to loss could lead to a dangerous emotional numbness, a point where a soldier felt nothing at all, which was its own kind of psychological injury. How did this mass-scale, unprocessed grief affect the soldiers' ability to reintegrate into society when they returned home? Did armies that had chaplains or other psychological support systems see a difference in their soldiers' ability to cope with loss? And what were the long-term consequences for a generation of men who were taught that showing emotion in the face of tragedy was a weakness? Number 9, what was the price of a good night's sleep? Sleep is a biological necessity. It restores the body and resets the mind. But for the soldier on the front line, true restorative sleep was a forgotten dream. The inability to get consistent, quality rest was one of the most debilitating and universal problems they faced. It was a form of slow burn torture that eroded their physical health, their mental acuity, and their emotional stability. On the front line, there was no night. The concept of a quiet 8-hour stretch of darkness did not exist. At any moment, the night could be shattered by an artillery barrage, a patrol returning, or an enemy attack. Even when things were quiet, soldiers had to stand guard duty, typically in 2-hour shifts. This meant their sleep was always fragmented. They might get an hour here, 2 hours there, but never the deep, uninterrupted REM sleep that is crucial for mental and physical recovery. They learned to sleep anywhere they could in a muddy foxhole, leaning against a tree, curled up in the back of a truck. Sleep was something to be grabbed in fleeting moments, not a reliable part of a daily routine. The conditions were almost always terrible. They were often wet, cold, and uncomfortable. They had to sleep in their clothes and boots with their weapon by their side. The ground was hard. They were plagued by insects, and always there was the noise. The distant crump of artillery, the rumble of engines, the sounds of nervous comrades shifting in the dark. It was impossible to fully relax. The part of your brain responsible for threat detection was always on, listening, waiting. This state of semi-alertness, even during sleep, is incredibly draining. The American military has since conducted numerous studies on the effects of sleep deprivation on soldiers. For instance, research from the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research has shown conclusively that losing even a few hours of sleep a night severely impairs cognitive functions like decision-making, reaction time, and vigilance. The soldiers of the Second World War were living in a state of chronic, severe sleep deprivation for years. The cumulative effect was devastating. Physically, it led to constant exhaustion and a weakened immune system, making them more susceptible to disease. Mentally, it made them irritable, prone to errors in judgment, and emotionally volatile. The world of the sleep-deprived soldier was a gray, weary landscape. In many memoirs, soldiers described this state as a walking stupor, where they were functioning on autopilot, their movements mechanical, their minds clouded by a fog of fatigue. Bill Mauldin's Willie and Joe characters, with their drooping eyelids and perpetually exhausted expressions, were not an exaggeration. They were a perfect representation of men who had forgotten what it felt like to be fully rested. How many accidents and tactical errors were a direct result of decisions made by sleep-deprived officers and NCOs? Did the side that was better able to manage its troops' sleep cycles and provide them with secure rear areas for rest gain a significant battlefield advantage? And what were the long-term neurological and psychological effects of years of sustained sleep deprivation on these men's health after the war? Number 8, how do you fight when you don't know why? Non-soldiers are given orders and they are expected to follow them. Take that hill, hold this line, but behind those orders is supposed to be a larger purpose, a reason for the sacrifice. One of the most insidious problems for the common soldier was the fog of war, not just in a tactical sense, but in a strategic one. They often had very little understanding of how their small, brutal piece of the war fit into the bigger picture. This lack of context could lead to a corrosive sense of futility. Imagine you are an infantryman in a rifle company. Your world is about 500 yards in any direction. Your primary concerns are your squad, your next meal, and the location of the enemy in front of you. A lieutenant tells you to attack a specific farmhouse. You don't know why that farmhouse is important. You don't know if it's part of a massive offensive or just a local skirmish. You only know that you have to cross an open field and people might not make it back. After a brutal fight, you take the farmhouse. The next day, you are ordered to abandon it and fall back. To the generals looking at a map miles away, this might have been a feint or a probing attack, a perfectly logical move in the grand chess game. But to the soldiers who bled for that piece of ground, it can feel utterly meaningless. It can feel like their friends were sacrificed for nothing. This was a common experience. The military is a hierarchical organization, and information flows downward on a need-to-know basis. For the man at the bottom, the need to know was often very little. They were cogs in a machine so vast they couldn't even see the machine, let alone understand how it worked. This was especially true in long grinding campaigns of attrition, where the lines on the map barely moved for months, but the casualties mounted daily. The fighting in places like the Bocage country of Normandy after the D-Day landings was a prime example. Units would fight desperately for days to take a single hedgerow, only to face another identical hedgerow 100 yards away. The bigger picture of the breakout from the beachhead was invisible to them. All they saw was the endless, bloody work of taking one field at a time. The writer and veteran J. Glenn Gray, in his philosophical book The Warrior's Reflections on Men in Battle, explored this idea. He wrote about the soldiers' concrete consciousness, their focus on the immediate, tangible reality, and how the abstract goals of the war often faded into the background. This lack of purpose could be deeply demoralizing. Propaganda and news from home could provide a general reason for the war, but it was often too abstract to sustain a man in a muddy foxhole. Why this trench? Why this hill? When the why is missing, the what becomes much harder to endure. It can lead to cynicism, a feeling that your life is being wasted by incompetent and uncaring leaders. The most effective junior officers were often the ones who understood this. They would take the time to explain the mission to their men, even if it was just the local, tactical why. It could make all the difference. Did units whose leaders were better at communicating the purpose of a mission suffer from lower rates of psychological breakdown? How did the different national armies compare in their approach to keeping their soldiers informed about the progress of the war? And how much of the anti-war sentiment that emerged in literature after the conflict was born from this feeling of fighting and dying for reasons that were never made clear? Number 7, could you ever trust anyone again? War forces people into extreme situations, and extreme situations can reveal the best and the worst of human nature. For soldiers on the front line, this created a complex and damaging psychological problem, a profound erosion of trust. This wasn't just about trusting the enemy, it was about the breakdown of trust in their leaders, in the civilians they encountered, and sometimes even in each other. Trust in leadership was the first to be tested. Soldiers quickly learned that there was a huge difference between a good officer and a bad one. A good officer was competent, looked out for his men, and didn't take unnecessary risks. A bad officer could be incompetent, ambitious, or simply out of his depth. He might order a foolish attack that resulted in heavy, pointless casualties. This experience, repeated across the front, bred a deep-seated cynicism among veteran soldiers. They learned to distinguish between orders that made sense and orders that were likely to get them killed for no good reason. The slang term REMF, Rear Echelon Mother F, became common, a term of contempt for the staff officers far from the danger who were making life and death decisions. The memoir, A Helmet for My Pillow, by Robert Leckie, details the enlisted Marines' view of the officer corps, a mixture of respect for the good ones and deep resentment for the bad ones. Trust in civilians was another casualty. When an army moves through a foreign country, the line between friend and foe is often blurry. A friendly farmer offering you food could be a partisan gathering information. A child waving from the side of the road could be a spotter. Soldiers had to learn to be suspicious of everyone. This was especially true in areas with strong resistance movements. A moment of carelessness, of trusting the wrong person could be fatal. This constant suspicion changes a person. It forces you to view every stranger as a potential threat. It walls you off from normal human interaction. After months or years of this, it becomes a default setting that is very hard to turn off. Most painfully, the extreme stress of combat could sometimes strain the trust even between soldiers in the same unit. The fear and exhaustion could make men selfish or unreliable. A man who was supposed to be watching your back might fall asleep on guard duty. In the desperate scramble for survival, not everyone lived up to the ideal of brotherhood. These instances were perhaps rare, but they left deep scars. The knowledge that even your comrades could fail you was a heavy burden. The military justice system was kept busy with cases of desertion and other failures of duty, a testament to the fact that not everyone could handle the pressure. How did this pervasive culture of mistrust affect a soldier's ability to form healthy relationships after the war? Were there specific training programs or leadership styles that proved more effective at building and maintaining trust within a unit under fire? And how many acts of betrayal, small and large, occurred on the front lines that were never recorded, but which haunted the men involved for the rest of their lives? Number 6, what do you do when waiting is the hardest part? The popular image of war is one of constant action, but for the vast majority of soldiers, the reality was the opposite. The dominant experience of frontline life was not fighting, but waiting. Endless, mind-numbing, nerve-wracking boredom. This wasn't a relaxing, peaceful boredom. It was a tense, anxious state of inactivity that could be more psychologically damaging than combat itself. A unit would move into a new position, a trench, a line of foxholes, a ruined village, and then they would wait. They would wait for orders. They would wait for the enemy to attack. They would wait for the supply trucks. They would wait for mail from home. They would wait for the weather to change. This waiting could go on for days, weeks, even months. During these long lulls, there was very little to do. They would clean their weapons over and over again. They would dig their foxholes deeper. They would play cards, read, write letters, or just sit and stare into space. The days would stretch into an indistinguishable, monotonous blur. This boredom was dangerous. It gave men too much time to think, to worry, to let their imaginations run wild. They would brood over their situation, their chances of survival, the family they left behind. The anxiety would build. The waiting before a planned attack was the worst. Everyone knew it was coming. They knew that in a few hours or at dawn the next day, they would have to leave the relative safety of their hole and advance into mortal danger. This period of waiting was a form of pure psychological torment. The author and veteran Kurt Vonnegut, in his novel Slaughterhouse-Five, captured this sense of helpless waiting, of being an insignificant pawn moved by immense, incomprehensible forces. His characters are often just waiting for the next terrible thing to happen. The military understood that an idle mind was a problem. Door to boredom would make work projects digging unnecessary trenches, stringing extra wire. But soldiers saw through this. The boredom was a fundamental part of their existence. It was punctuated by moments of sheer terror, and then it would return. This cycle of long periods of anxious boredom followed by short bursts of intense traumatic action was incredibly hard on the human nervous system. It created a state of constant low-level stress with no release and no distraction. Soldiers became experts at hurry up and wait. They could be rushed to a new position with incredible urgency only to sit there doing nothing for a week. This constant uncertainty and lack of control over their own time was profoundly frustrating and demoralizing. Did armies that were better at keeping their soldiers occupied and mentally stimulated during lulls in the fighting have lower rates of combat fatigue? What were the most common and ingenious ways that soldiers invented to combat boredom on their own? And how did this experience of chronic, anxious waiting shape their personalities, making them perhaps more patient or more cynical after the war? Number 5, how did they keep believing in luck? In a world governed by chaos and chance, where survival often seemed completely random, soldiers desperately needed something to believe in. And for many, that something was luck. They developed complex systems of superstition, ritual, and belief in talismans. This wasn't a trivial sideshow. It was a critical psychological coping mechanism for dealing with overwhelming fear and a total lack of control over their own fate. Soldiers would carry good luck charms. It could be anything: a photo of a sweetheart, a child's baby shoe, a special coin, a prayer book, or even a captured enemy insignia. These objects were treated with the utmost seriousness. Losing a talisman could be seen as a terrible omen. The object itself had no power, of course, but the belief invested in it did. It provided a small, tangible sense of protection in a world where there was none. But it was a way of imposing a little bit of personal order onto a universe of pure random violence. The anthropologist Martha Gellhorn, who reported on the war, observed these behaviors and understood them not as childish beliefs, but as essential tools for mental survival. Rituals were also common. A soldier might have a specific way of putting on his gear every morning. Another might always smoke a cigarette before going on patrol. These small, repetitive actions provided a sense of routine and normalcy in an abnormal world. They were a way of saying, I did this yesterday and I survived, so if I do it again today, I will survive again. Breaking the ritual could cause intense anxiety. They also developed a host of superstitions. It was considered bad luck to light 3 cigarettes from the same match, a superstition that some say dates back to the First World War, where a sniper might see the light on the first cigarette, take aim on the second, and fire on the third. Whether true or not, the belief was what mattered. Certain words or phrases were considered taboo. You didn't talk about your plans for after the war in too much detail, for fear of jinxing yourself. This belief system could also manifest as a kind of fatalism. Many soldiers came to believe that a projectile either had your name on it or it didn't. If it did, there was nothing you could do. If it didn't, you were untouchable. This belief, while grim, could be liberating. It freed a soldier from the constant paralyzing calculus of risk. It allowed him to function, to do his job, without being crippled by fear. Historian John Dower, in his book War Without Mercy, touches on the different cultural attitudes toward fate and death, but the underlying need to make sense of the senseless was universal. For the individual soldier, a personal system of luck and fate was often more immediate and more comforting than the abstract promises of religion or patriotism. Did soldiers who had strong superstitious beliefs have a better chance of avoiding psychological breakdown than those who didn't? How did these personal belief systems interact with organized religion, which was also a major source of comfort for many? And when the war was over, did these veterans carry their talismans and rituals with them back into civilian life? Number 4, how does your body break down in ways you never expected? The obvious physical dangers of war are clear, but the front lines inflicted a host of other, less dramatic, but equally debilitating physical ailments on soldiers. These were the breakdowns caused not by weapons, but by the environment, the stress, and the sheer physical grind of daily life. The constant pain and discomfort from these non-combat injuries were a major and often overlooked problem. Your dental problems were a huge issue. Soldiers were living on a poor diet, often with lots of sugar in the form of hard candy or sweetened coffee. They had limited opportunities for proper dental hygiene. The result was an epidemic of cavities, toothaches, and gum infections. A raging toothache in a foxhole is not a minor problem. The pain can be all-consuming, making it impossible to eat, sleep, or concentrate. Army dentists worked tirelessly in field hospitals behind the lines, but for the man on the front, relief could be days or weeks away. It was another source of constant draining misery. Foot problems were universal. We've already discussed trench foot, but even in good weather, a soldier's feet took a terrible beating. They were always marching, always on their feet, carrying heavy loads. The standard issue leather boots were tough, but they were often poorly fitted and required a long, painful break-in period. Eye blisters were a constant plague. An infected blister could be as incapacitating as a minor wound. Fungal infections were common. The simple act of taking off your boots at the end of a long day and seeing the state of your raw, swollen feet was a deeply demoralizing ritual. Back problems were also endemic. Carrying 60-plus pounds of gear day after day, digging trenches for hours on end, and sleeping on hard, uneven ground took a massive toll on the spine. Young, fit men in their early 20s would develop the chronic back pain of someone twice their age. This was an injury that didn't bleed and wasn't dramatic, but it was a constant nagging source of pain that reduced a soldier's effectiveness and his quality of life. And hearing loss was another insidious injury. The constant exposure to the noise of artillery, small arms fire, and vehicle engines caused permanent damage to the soldier's hearing. Tinnitus, a constant ringing in the ears, became a lifelong companion for many. At the time, there was little understanding of long-term noise-induced hearing loss, and no real hearing protection was issued. The damage was silent and cumulative. In the 1999 book War in the Body, Joanna Bork explores how the experience of war is written onto the soldier's physical self in countless, often invisible ways. These mundane physical breakdowns were a fundamental part of that experience. How many soldiers were evacuated from the front lines not for combat wounds, but for seemingly minor ailments like a dental abscess or a back injury? Did the armies with better field medicine and preventative care for these issues maintain a higher level of combat readiness? And what was the total long-term cost to society in caring for a generation of veterans who suffered from these chronic, non-combat physical injuries for the rest of their lives? Number 3, what does it mean to lose your name? When a young man joins the Army, he is given a serial number. He is issued a uniform that is identical to a million others. He is trained to march in step, to respond to commands, to act as part of a collective. This process is necessary to build a disciplined fighting force, but it comes with a hidden cost: the erosion of individual identity. For many soldiers, one of the strangest and most disorienting challenges was the feeling that they were ceasing to be a unique person and becoming an anonymous, interchangeable part. This started with the name. While they still had their names, in the day-to-day language of the military, they were often reduced to a number, a rank, or a function. You were a rifleman, a machine gunner, a replacement. Your personal history of your job back home, your family, your hobbies faded into the background, became irrelevant to the immediate task of survival. The Army was not interested in who you were, it was interested in what you could do. This could be liberating. For some, a chance to escape a past they didn't like. But for many, it was a profoundly alienating experience. It felt like the person they had been for their entire life was being systematically erased. The term replacement or reinforcement was particularly dehumanizing. When a unit suffered casualties, new soldiers would be sent up from the rear to fill the empty slots. These men arrived alone or in small groups, strangers thrown into a tight-knit squad that had been through hell together. The veterans were often reluctant to get to know the new arrivals. They had lost too many friends already. They knew the statistical probability that this new face might not be around for long, so they kept their distance. The replacement was just the new guy, a nameless cog filling a space in the machine. Imagine the profound loneliness of that position. You are in the most dangerous place on earth, surrounded by people, but you are a complete outsider, an unknown quantity whose very presence is a reminder of a loss. The historian Stephen Ambrose wrote about this replacement system and its brutal psychological effects on both the new men and the veterans. This loss of identity was reinforced by the environment. In a landscape of ruined buildings and churned up earth, where everyone wore the same muddy uniform and had the same weary expression, individuality seemed to melt away. You were just one of a mass of struggling humanity. This feeling of anonymity could be terrifying. It suggested that your individual life had no value, that you were as disposable as a piece of equipment. The struggle to hold on to a sense of self, to remember who you were before all this, became a quiet internal battle for every soldier. It was why letters from home were so important. They were a reminder that you were a son, a brother, a husband, a person with a unique place in the world. How did the different methods of replenishing units, for example, the American system of individual replacements versus the British system of rebuilding whole units, affect soldier morale and identity? Did soldiers who managed to maintain a strong sense of their pre-war identity cope better with the psychological stresses of the conflict? And after the war, was it difficult for these men to rediscover the person they had been before they were a number? Number 2, who were you fighting for? The posters and the propaganda were clear. You were fighting for your country, for freedom, for democracy, for the folks back home. And on a macro level, that was true, but in the day-to-day reality of the foxhole, those big abstract ideas often felt very far away. The immediate, powerful motivation that kept soldiers going was something much smaller and much more personal each other. The primary loyalty of a frontline soldier was not to a flag or a general, it was to the other men in his squad. This phenomenon has been documented in countless studies and memoirs. When asked what they were fighting for, veterans rarely talk about ideology. They talk about their friends. They talk about not letting down the man next to them. The small unit, the squad or platoon, became a kind of surrogate family. These were the men you shared everything with: your food, your water, your fear, your life story. Your survival was directly dependent on their competence and their courage, and theirs on yours. This created a bond of interdependence and mutual responsibility that was more powerful than any order from a superior officer. You fought to protect your friends, you advanced because you couldn't bear the shame of being seen as a coward in their eyes. The book Men Against Fire by S.L.A. Marshall was one of the first major works to systematically study this. Marshall's research, based on post-combat interviews, concluded that this loyalty to the immediate group was the single most important factor in sustaining a soldier in combat. A soldier's fear of failing his comrades was often greater than his fear of the enemy. This created an intense and sometimes problematic dynamic. The needs of the small group could sometimes come into conflict with the orders of the larger organization. Squads would look after their own, sometimes bending rules or losing equipment to make sure their own group was taken care of. This intense loyalty also had a dark side. It's what made the loss of a comrade so devastating. It's what made the arrival of new replacements so difficult. And it made the transition back to civilian life incredibly hard. When the war was over, this intense life or death bond was suddenly gone. Veterans often felt a profound sense of loss and alienation when they returned home. They were surrounded by people who loved them but who could never understand what they had been through. They missed the simple, absolute clarity of their purpose on the front line to keep their friends alive. The author and veteran William Manchester wrote about this feeling in his memoir, Goodbye Darkness, describing a lifelong yearning for the intense camaraderie he had experienced as a young Marine. It was a paradox. They had longed for the war to end, but when it did, they found themselves missing the one good thing that had come out of it. Did the intensity of these small unit bonds vary between different armies and different cultures? How did military leaders try to leverage this powerful force of group loyalty to improve combat effectiveness? And for the veterans, was the memory of this intense comradeship a source of lifelong strength, or a painful reminder of a world to which they could never return? Number 1, what do you do when the war follows you home? The fighting stopped, the treaties were signed, the soldiers came home. To the civilians who greeted them with parades and celebrations, the war was over. But for millions of veterans, the war was not over. It had simply moved from the fields of Europe and the islands of the Pacific to a new private battlefield inside their own minds. The final, and perhaps most unexpected, problem was that the front line was not a place you could simply leave behind. They came home changed. They were often quieter, more withdrawn. They were prone to irritability and sudden bursts of anger. Many found it impossible to sleep through the night, plagued by nightmares that replayed the same terrible scenes over and over. They were jumpy. A loud noise, like a car backfiring, could send them diving for cover. They felt a profound sense of alienation from their families and communities. They had been through an experience that was so far outside the realm of normal human life that there were no words to describe it. How could you explain to your wife or your parents the feeling of constant fear, the sight of things no one should ever have to see, the loss of your closest friends? Because they couldn't explain it, they often didn't talk about it at all. They buried it. At the time, the understanding of this condition was limited. It was called combat fatigue, or shell shock, terms that suggested it was a temporary state of exhaustion from which a man would eventually recover. The psychiatrist William C. Menninger, who served as the U.S. Army's chief of psychiatry during the war, did groundbreaking work in identifying and treating these conditions near the front. He recognized that these were genuine psychological injuries, not signs of weakness or cowardice, but once the soldiers were discharged, the support systems were often inadequate. The prevailing attitude in society was that these men should just get over it, be grateful they survived, and get on with their lives. So many of them suffered in silence. They threw themselves into their work. They started families. They tried to build a normal life. But the war was always there, a ghost at the banquet. It affected their relationships with their spouses and children. It made it hard for them to hold down a job. Many turned to alcohol to numb the memories and quiet the anxiety. The rates of alcoholism, divorce, and suicide among veterans in the decades after the war were tragically high. It wasn't until much later, with the study of veterans from subsequent conflicts, that the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was fully developed and understood as a long-term debilitating injury. The men of the Second World War were the largest generation to ever suffer from it, but they did so with the least amount of public understanding or medical support. The book The Best Years of Our Lives, a film released in 1946, was one of the first and most sensitive portrayals of this difficult readjustment, showing veterans struggling to reconnect with a world that no longer made sense to them. What is the true uncounted cost of the war, measured in decades of quiet suffering, broken families, and shortened lives? How many great minds and creative talents were lost, not on the battlefield, but in the long, silent aftermath? And what have we learned or failed to learn from their experience that could help us better care for the soldiers who fight our wars today?